Did you know that chronic inflammation could be damaging not only your bones, but also all of your other organs? Chronic inflammation is probably at the root of most chronic health conditions. It's likely affecting your bones, it's affecting your hormones, it's affecting your heart, it's probably affecting your brain, and on and on and on. Chronic inflammation is a big deal. And the good news is there's a lot of things you can do to improve it. Now, I'm going to talk about some things at the end of this video that I think will be helpful for the vast majority of people. But know that chronic inflammation can be associated with a lot of different things. And there's a lot of different rabbit holes that you could go down. But most people are probably experiencing inflammation that they don't need to. So let's dig into this. So first of all, we need to define inflammation. So inflammation is a totally natural process. Acute inflammation or response to an injury or an exposure is what we want our body to do. Our immune systems are really good at this. It's what's kept us alive as a species. But chronic inflammation, meaning that same response that you see with an acute injury, like if you bump your shin on a table, you get that swelling, that redness, that bump, like that's all acute inflammation. But that process happening indolently, slowly, chronically, that can lead to a lot of dysfunction over time. And we actually see it in a lot of our patients. I want to pass that along to you. So where does this likely come from? Well, like I said, there are a lot of factors. But if we look at some basic lifestyle stuff, if you consider the way that we treat patients, how we use our health optimization pyramid to focus on lifestyle out of the gate, yes, there are a lot of rabbit holes we could go down, like, dental fillings and Lyme disease and like all of these different things that are real. But most people are experiencing chronic inflammation from poor lifestyle choices. The question is, which ones are the most important? So there is a diet component to this. There's an exercise, or rather lack thereof, of exercise, or for some people, too much exercise, right? You can actually over-exercise and you can overtrain, and that's going to result in chronic inflammation as well, ironically. Chronic stress, how many people do you know or do you yourself feel chronic stress, stressed out all the time? Associative oxidative stress, and then underlying health conditions like autoimmunity, exposure to toxins, heavy metals, and on and on and on and on. So I'm going to give you some tips on each of those categories as we go through this. And know that, again, there are so many things that you can do from a daily decision-making perspective that are going to help you to reduce your chronic inflammation. Okay, so let's run through some of these primary players so that we can figure out what to do. So let's talk about poor diet. Now, diet can be inflammatory for a lot of reasons. Again, there's a lot of things that we could potentially dig into here. But most of you, if you've been watching this channel for a while, you know that I'm a big advocate for consuming animal protein. Be careful what you listen to, because you might hear a lot of people say that meat is inflammatory. Absolutely not true. If you eat a hamburger with a bun and french fries and a milkshake, that's inflammatory, but the meat is not the problem. So I think meat's been wrongly villainized in this case, and meat is not inflammatory. And you see that in the carnivore community, because people that are eating only meat have very low levels of inflammation. And if they had an autoimmune disease, a lot of times they can put that into remission. So we know that meat is by nature not particularly inflammatory. So don't avoid eating adequate protein from animal sources. What about dairy? Now, if you listen to, again, to go back to the carnivore community, if you listen to all of the carnivore community, they're going to likely tell you that dairy shouldn't be an issue for most people. The challenge I have with that is that I see something different. Now, my patients are not carnivores for the most part, so maybe that has something to do with it. But in my experience, dairy is not tolerated by all. In fact, I would argue dairy is not tolerated by somewhere around half of our patients. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't consume any dairy, but they probably aren't consuming milk. Milk's maybe not the best source anyway. The problem with dairy is that it is innately unnatural to begin with. We lose the ability to process lactose. With the enzyme lactase, we need to make it to break down lactose. We naturally lose that over time. So a lot of people can't digest the lactose. There are other proteins in there too. Casein, for example. There's a bunch of other proteins that we can test for intolerance to. And if you're intolerant to any of those things, it could be inflammatory, and that's going to result in chronic inflammation. So for some people, consuming dairy as an attempt to improve their bone health may not be helpful. This is one that I would recommend testing, though, because dairy is a powerful tool when you're looking to improve your bone health. All right, so what about the highly processed food category? I think most of you probably know that I'm an advocate for a whole foods diet, meaning that we want to eat the whole, not the store, we want to eat the products of food in their most natural form. So highly processed foods then is just automatically going against that. Highly processed foods are interesting because as you get into a more and more processed food, it's going to have usually more preservatives, more chemicals. It's going to be less like what our bodies understand. I look at food as a signal. You're telling your body something when you consume food. And if you're consuming a new food product that your body's never seen, it doesn't know. It doesn't know what to do with that food. So I feel like we need to be very careful with highly processed foods. I'm not saying you can't eat them at all, but I would encourage you to eat as little as possible. Same thing with added sugar. I think sugar that naturally comes through a whole foods diet, so you're getting sugar through either starchy vegetables or through fruit, it's totally fine. I think unless somebody is remarkably metabolically unhealthy, they can tolerate that much carbohydrate, and the sugar that you're getting naturally is totally fine. However, added sugar becomes an issue. Added sucrose, added fructose, all of this becomes an issue, especially if you're drinking it. So added sugar can definitely be inflammatory, but it doesn't mean that you have to eat a ketogenic diet. There is a wide spectrum of carbohydrate intake, and most of our patients, in my experience with osteoporosis, are not carbohydrate intolerant, although some are. But most are not. So eating carbohydrates can be a good source to fuel your body for exercise. And we are trying to teach our patients how to be more active, to do more exercise, to do more resistance training, et cetera. So what about healthy fats? I hear this term a lot, and it can be really confusing because for some people, when they say healthy fats, they mean vegetable oil. For some people, when they say healthy fats, they mean saturated fat. Other people mean avocado oil and other omega-3s. So let's break this down. An unhealthy fat is a fat that's going to result in inflammation. For some people, a small minority of people, saturated fat can be inflammatory. We can test that genetically. That one's actually pretty easy. But for people that don't have those genetic SNPs, saturated fat is probably not inflammatory, although we've all been told that it causes heart disease. I think in the vast majority of people, it doesn't. And then there are the vegetable oil side. So let's just break this down a little bit. So saturated fats are fully saturated, and then you have your monounsaturated fats. So that's gonna be like your olive oil and your avocado oil. So those are monounsaturated fats, meaning that they have one single bond in there. And then the polyunsaturated fats, or also known as vegetable oils or seed oils, they have multiple single bonds that are going to predispose them to being denatured and become inflammatory, to become rancid is another way to say that. So from my perspective, if you can tolerate saturated fat, I like it. If you can't, or if you also want to just avoid it, that's also fine. Consuming olive oil, avocado oil for cooking, olive oil for cold, that's a really nice in-between because you're getting kind of the best of both worlds. It has both in it. It's mostly monounsaturated, and therefore we can lean on these even though we don't have a long history of what this does over time. We know that from a biomarker perspective, these are going to be low inflammation and associated with better outcomes when you do look at diet studies. And then you have the vegetable oils, the seed oils. My concern about these things is the way that they're used. The evidence behind saying that these are bad for you is really not that strong, but they are new to our environment. They're new to our bodies. We've not been consuming them for a long time. I am concerned that those single bonds do deform, especially with UV exposure, with heat. They can become rancid, and when that happens, they get incorporated into our cell membranes, and they can cause all kinds of weird downstream things. So people will say that the research is not that strong saying that these oils are not good. My argument is, why are they innocent until proven guilty? They're new. They should be proven good unless we don't use them, right? So if you want to use a new oil, let's prove that it doesn't cause bad things rather than giving it to everybody and then seeing what happens. So my preference is to avoid the seed oils, avoid the vegetable oils. That's just a nice marketing ploy. These things are probably dangerous, especially if you're frying with them, if you're cooking with them. Bad idea. Please stop doing that. So healthy fats for me, monounsaturated, saturated genetically if you can tolerate it, and a little bit of this is fine. Just don't lean on this too heavily because we've been told that this is healthy and we're not getting healthier as a result. All right, so what about exercise? Well, I mentioned that there's a full spectrum here, right? So like sedentary life, meaning that you're not doing any exercise or only walking a couple thousand steps a day, that's going to actually result in chronic inflammation. But so is running 3 to 5 miles every day. So is sitting on a treadmill or a Stairmaster, right? If you are doing chronic high-level cardio, that's also inflammatory. So we want to do the things that are right for us. So if you hear what I've said in other videos on exercise, this is lifting heavy things to the best of your ability so you don't get injured. That is doing impact training if you have osteoporosis. Walking, preferably 10,000 steps or more every day so that you can keep your body moving. Those three things are going to be anti-inflammatory. Everything else in between potentially has benefit, just depends on how you're doing it. And remember too, from a frequency perspective, we need to do something every day. I'm not saying you need to lift weights every day. Your body also needs to recover, but you need to do something every day. Getting out, going for another walk, doing the resistance training, going to some kind of an exercise class, going to a yoga class if you have the capacity to do that, Pilates, etc. Make sure we're active. We, in our modern societies, just sit behind a screen all day long, staring at blue light like I am right now, staring at our phones, scrolling through Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube, whatever. That's very unnatural for our bodies. I'm not saying don't do it. I do it too. But put that thing down, go out for a walk, go lift weights. All right, now what about stress? Now, I just mentioned our modern world puts our devices in our hands. It puts screens right in front of us. I have multiple screens in here all over the place. Do you think that causes inflammation? You betcha. Not only is the UV light very unnatural, our brains have no idea what's happening during the day when I'm sitting in here under all these lights. Our brains don't know what to do with this information. So it's very confusing. It messes with our circadian rhythm. We also then add to, as I mentioned, the feed before, right? So if I'm on here and I'm looking at the news, I'm wondering what's happening with the election, like that's going to trigger stress for me. I mean, anybody, not just me. That's going to trigger social stress if you're looking at things that are happening around you, what's happening with your family, with your partner, with your kids, with your grandkids. Do you have stress around your health? A lot of my patients do. They have osteoporosis. They're worried about fracture. That's stressful. What about what's going on in the world? What about world safety? What about our economy, personal safety? Or do you feel safe in your environment? Are you worried about global warming? What about the next pandemic? I mean, oh my gosh, did I just stress you out? So remember that that's what they're trying to do. They want you to click on these things. They want you to engage. So they're going to do the things that are most engaging for you. And that's going to be the things probably that stress you out the most. So just understand that. I'm not saying don't use it. I'm just saying understand it. And we have to mitigate the stress. And I have some strategies for stress mitigation at the end of this video. So what about other things like underlying health conditions? Well, yeah, like autoimmune disease, rheumatoid arthritis, chronic infections. I mentioned dental stuff earlier. Dental infections, heavy metal exposure, Lyme, CMV, metabolic health. So many of those things can cause chronic inflammation. That's when you start kind of going down the rabbit holes. Most people don't need to go down the rabbit holes yet. There are so many things that you can do to help reduce inflammation without working with a functional medicine practitioner and getting all this functional medicine testing. Remember that when you view your bone health through the lens of health span, meaning how to live better longer, a lot of those things are going to be addressed at the same time. So there is definitely a role for all those things. All right, so let's talk about exposure to toxins. Now, I've mentioned this a little bit already, but we live in a toxic environment. People say, well, what do you mean? We do not live in the same environment that our parents lived in. We don't live in the same environment, certainly, that our grandparents lived in. There are thousands of chemicals being created, these new chemicals that are being created and approved for use in our environment, in our food containers, in our industrial processing processes, these things that our bodies have never seen before. So these are things like BPA, different plastics, endocrine disruptors, heavy metals that are being exposed to that we would never have seen before, pesticides, glyphosate. All of these things could potentially have a negative impact. So we want to find a way to avoid these things. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that later. So you can tell that there's a lot of ways you can be exposed to inflammation. So that's a real problem. I want to reinforce how important it is, though, by talking about the way that inflammation results in bone loss. So hear me out. When you are inflamed, these pro-inflammatory things called cytokines, so these things that are messaging molecules in the body with the immune system, they're called things like TNF alpha, IL-1/6, interleukin-1. These things stimulate osteoclasts to break down bone. It's part of the process. They also inhibit osteoblast differentiation and function. So you've heard me talk about bone metabolism before, where osteoclasts break down bone, osteoblasts build bone. Most natural things will impact both sides of that equation, and this is going to impact it in the way that you're going to lose more bone. Now, these cytokines also work through the rank ligand pathway. So you've probably heard me talk about that from a drug perspective, and we know that the rank ligand pathway is also going to promote osteoclast differentiation. So you're working on osteoclasts in multiple ways. You're working on osteoblasts to prevent them from doing their thing. So inflammation certainly can be tied to bone loss. So how does this tie in then with this concept of oxidative stress? Well, I've started talking more and more about oxidative stress because I think we're being exposed to a lot of oxidative stress, particularly for people that are seeing chronic inflammation. So as our immune system is working with all of its tools to do whatever it is that it's trying to do, one of the things that it creates is reactive oxygen species, ROSs. ROSs result in oxidative stress. So if someone has chronic inflammation, they likely also have significant oxidative stress, chronic oxidative stress. This results in activation of certain parts of the immune system, particularly the macrophages and the T cells. And guess what? This is a cycle that just propagates itself. So those also will then have a negative impact on bone. They're going to inhibit bone formation. They're going to promote bone resorption. They're also going to have impact on the hormones. We know that once that system gets going, it'll shut down sex hormones. It doesn't matter female or male. You're going to lose testosterone. You're going to lose estrogen. You're going to have deficient progesterone. If you're still cycling as a woman, you're going to probably have dysfunctional cycles. This is what chronic inflammation looks like. You can eventually get elevation of cortisol. Cortisol is an inflammatory tool that your body uses for a lot of different things. You've probably heard of it as a drug. But when you get elevated cortisol, it further disrupts sex hormones. It starts to disrupt thyroid function. It starts to disrupt your gut, and it's going to continue to negatively impact your bone. So all of these things sort of feed each other. You have to find a way to break that cycle. So before I get into the answers to some of these things, we've talked about a few of them. I just wanted to mention that if you are struggling to put together everything, consider coming to our masterclass. Our masterclass is a totally free opportunity to hear how I put together programs for our Platinum program for optimizing bone health, and then also do kind of a Q&A session at the end. It's a really, really powerful tool for people that are new to the bone health space. If you're not new to the bone health space and you need some support, consider coming to our HealthSpan Nation. Our HealthSpan Nation is our community where we meet weekly. We have a topic-driven Q&A, and then the community works together to help to support each other, to promote each other in their own bone health journey. So a really, really great community. Weekly Q&A. You can really get a lot of information out of that. And there's a ton of content that we've created that you can search now that is going to help you to answer your questions about what to do to improve your bone health. All right, so what do we do about all this inflammation? Well, let me walk you through these things. So first of all, I'm going to go back to diet. Now, I've kind of already walked through what I think about diet, and you've probably heard me talk about this before. So let me just say a couple of things. An anti-inflammatory diet doesn't need to have a name, but if you want to give it a name, consider a diet like a paleo diet, like a Mediterranean diet, which is a pretty vague term. Low carb is an option for some people, not required for all people, but it needs to be high in antioxidants. And again, if you're struggling with what to do with your diet, consider joining our HealthSpan Nation, because that's an opportunity to ask others how they're getting through this and getting adequate protein. The next section is on exercise. Now, I've kind of already said this too, but exercise is tough for this population. So remember that you got to start somewhere. We want to meet you where you are. Walking is a really great way to start. And then adding resistance training to the best of your ability. If you're new to resistance training, you are not alone. That is very, very common in the osteoporosis community. Seek help. Work with a trainer. Let somebody help you get the right form so you don't hurt yourself. And then once you get that down, then let's start some impact training, because we need impact and resistance and walking to hit both health span and bone health. I would encourage you to avoid the chronic cardio, the chronic running, the chronic cycling, the chronic even swimming. There's value in all those things, but it has to do with the dose. Now, when it comes to stress mitigation, this is a really important one, because I find in this community of people with osteoporosis, stress is rampant. So if you're not doing any of these tools, you need to find one, pick one, and work on it. So these tools consider meditation, yoga, breath work, outdoor, just being outdoors. So in Japan, they call it forest bathing. Literally just walking outdoors, taking your shoes off, sticking your foot on the ground, grounding, limiting exposures to stress. And that could be limiting exposure to social media, to the news, to your neighbor. It doesn't matter what it is. Consider where your stress is coming from. Try to do something about it. Use a tool. It doesn't have to be a fancy tool. You don't have to become a yogi, but just finding time for yourself is important. I think actually exercise is a really important tool there as well. And then we've already talked about toxins a little bit, but here's a couple of additional tips. So when it comes to toxins, I encourage people to eat organic. I know this is, people say, oh, well, it doesn't matter. I think it does matter because while it doesn't solve all problems, at least if you're eating organic, you're eliminating some things. Encourage you to eat local. So if people are growing food locally, likely going to be in season. It has to be, if they're going to grow it. So it's in season and also going to be more likely organic that way. And it's going to have likely better soil because it hasn't been, unless you live on a farm, it hasn't been stripped of all the topsoil. So probably going to be better for you across the board. If possible, grow your own food. Then you have absolute control, right? So you can control your own soil. You can put in the inputs that you want. You can decide what you can grow or potentially animals that you can raise. And if you can do that, I think it's awesome. I look forward to doing more of that in my future. I think ultimately you want to have this idea of how do I live clean? How do I avoid the things like the parabens, the phthalates, the sulfates, the synthetic fragrances? There's a lot of resources here you could consider, but it takes work. So consider things like the Environmental Working Group or the EWG. We'll have links for all these in the description on YouTube. There's another app called the Healthy Living app. There's different product scanners and databases. We have all those things in the description. So in conclusion, I think that lifestyle is a very, very powerful tool when it comes to reducing chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation is a big player in bone health. So look at these things that I've talked about, the exercise, the nutrition, avoiding toxins, all of those things matter. They all stack up. The more you can take into your own hands and take control of, the better. Some of these simple things are really obvious. Some of the bigger ones are not, but start with the simple things. Stack wins. Make the good small decisions. And in the end, you're going to have a really powerful tool. So that's it. Remember that osteoporosis is not the end, but choosing to reverse it is a beginning. I'll see you in the next video.